What was supposed to be a joyful moment before a royal wedding turned into a volcanic eruption of emotions, secrets, and silent power plays. An insider has come forward, shattering years of royal silence to expose what really happened during that final dress fitting. Was it just about fabric and lace? Or was Meghan's final dress fitting the stage for betrayal, humiliation, and a deeper royal rift? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The final dress fitting did not take place in some glamorous atelier filled with laughter and champagne, as the public might imagine. Instead, it unfolded under tight security at an undisclosed royal estate, a location chosen not for comfort, but for control. Every hallway was monitored, every staff member vetted, every movement logged. This was not simply about protecting a gown worth millions, it was about containing a moment the palace already feared could spiral beyond its grip. From the very beginning, there was an unspoken understanding that this fitting mattered far more than anyone was willing to say out loud. Meghan arrived alone. No bridesmaids, no inner circle, no comforting voices to soften the tension. Those present noticed it immediately: the stiffness in her posture, the careful restraint in her smile, the way she scanned the room before saying a single word. She was polite, composed, and impeccably dressed, but beneath that calm surface sat a woman bracing herself for impact. Palace insiders would later say she looked less like a bride preparing for her wedding and more like someone stepping into hostile territory, aware that every word and reaction would be quietly judged. Tensions had already been simmering for weeks between Meghan and senior palace staff, but that morning they felt sharper, heavier, impossible to ignore. Small disagreements had accumulated into something darker, something personal. Decisions about the gown had been questioned, preferences had been challenged, authority had been subtly asserted in ways that left no visible fingerprints. According to one unnamed royal insider, the atmosphere inside the fitting room was thick with dread, the kind of silence that presses against the chest and makes even breathing feel loud. Every stitch, every adjustment, every whispered exchange carried weight. Staff members avoided eye contact. The seamstresses worked with clinical precision, aware that they were not just tailoring a dress, but navigating a minefield of royal sensitivities. No one laughed. No one relaxed. The insider would later say that it felt as though everyone in the room was waiting for something to happen, even if no one dared to say what that something might be. Both Camilla and Kate were scheduled to drop in, a phrase that sounded casual on paper but felt loaded in reality. Their attendance was framed as supportive, even familial, yet those present sensed it was anything but. This was not a friendly visit. This was oversight, observation, a reminder of hierarchy. Meghan was aware of it too, adjusting her tone, her expressions, even her body language as if preparing for an unspoken examination. The insider's words would echo long after the fitting ended. You could cut the energy with scissors sharper than the ones tailoring her gown. It was a moment balanced on the edge of something explosive, where tradition collided with change and politeness, barely masked resentment. No one yet knew how deeply this single fitting would fracture relationships, or how far its consequences would reach beyond that closed room. But it wasn't just the atmosphere that turned icy, it was a sudden interruption that would detonate the entire moment. She wasn't expected to stay. She wasn't expected to speak. But when Kate walked into that fitting room, something in the air changed. According to the insider, it was a single, sharply delivered comment disguised as a suggestion that triggered a chain reaction no one in the room was prepared for. The sound of the door clicking shut behind her was sharper than expected, as though it announced more than her mere presence. Meghan looked up from the mirror, her fingers still resting lightly on the fabric of her gown. Kate's expression, while technically polite, carried a chill that silenced the room. The seamstress paused, sensing something shift not just in tone, but in hierarchy. Kate's unannounced entry wasn't simply a royal courtesy. It was a statement. and it landed like a stone in water, sending ripples of discomfort through every soul present. She didn't make a scene. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was powerful enough to command stillness. Without so much as a greeting, she circled the gown like an inspector. Her eyes moved over the neckline, the silhouette, the embroidery. Then came the words, smoothly delivered, effortlessly cutting. Perhaps something more traditional would suit the occasion better. It wasn't phrased as an insult. But it wasn't meant to be a compliment either. It was an evaluation, cold and calculated, designed to remind Meghan without openly confronting her that this was not her show. Not really. The reaction was instant. Meghan froze, the colour in her cheeks rose, though she said nothing. But her eyes said everything. Shock. Hurt. And then rage, carefully disguised beneath a breathless silence. The seamstress, whose fingers had been carefully aligning the hem, let her hands fall away from the gown. The air had thickened again, heavier now. No one dared speak. It was the kind of silence that burns. Kate, meanwhile, remained poised, untouched by the tension she'd just ignited. According to the insider, her tone was formal, not friendly. And it stayed that way throughout her brief stay. She never addressed Meghan directly after that remark, instead turning to the staff, nodding at certain elements of the dress, as though her opinion was both required and final. She offered a small smile at the end, a royal courtesy that felt more like a smirk. For Meghan, that comment landed like a slap dressed in silk. The fitting, already an emotional minefield, had just transformed into a battlefield. And this wasn't an isolated moment. The animosity between them hadn't started here. It had been building slowly, silently, through a series of cold encounters, misinterpreted gestures, and wounds that were never allowed to heal. The final fitting was simply where it all boiled over, where years of simmering tension finally began to leak through the seams. Those in the room wouldn't forget it. The dress was now no longer just a gown. It was a symbol of everything Meghan was fighting for and against. It represented defiance, individuality, a refusal to conform. But standing across from her was the embodiment of tradition, authority, and royal expectation. In that moment, the dress was no longer being judged. She was. But just when it seemed things couldn't grow more uncomfortable, another royal arrived, and her entrance shattered what was left of the peace. She came in smiling, holding a gift bag, but the warmth was a performance. According to the royal insider, Queen Camilla's presence at the final fitting wasn't about support, it was about control. And what she said to Meghan, barely loud enough for others to hear, left the future Duchess visibly shaken. Her entrance was as unexpected as it was deliberate. No one had informed Meghan that Camilla would be attending. The palace never issued notice, no aide gave warning, and her name was nowhere on the itinerary. She simply appeared graceful, poised, and wrapped in the kind of polished charm that had long been her trademark. But for those who'd seen enough of the palace's inner workings, the unannounced visit carried all the markings of a calculated maneuver. Camilla didn't come to admire the dress. She came to deliver a message, and she chose the most fragile moment to deliver it. As she stepped into the room, her eyes didn't scan the gown first. They landed directly on Meghan. Her smile, though practiced, lacked true warmth. In her hands, a gift bag. Its contents, as it turned out, were far from sentimental. Inside was a brooch antique, ornate, and unmistakably traditional, a piece that symbolized everything Meghan was not. The gesture appeared thoughtful on the surface, but the undertones were unmistakable. It wasn't a gift. It was a reminder of place, of power, of the unspoken rules Meghan had dared to challenge. Witnesses say Meghan looked at the brooch for less than a second before quietly handing it back. No words, just a slight shake of the head. The moment was swift but sharp, and the silence that followed was deafening. Camilla's expression didn't shift. She leaned in, her voice low and calm. No one else could hear exactly what was said, but the effect was immediate. Meghan's face tightened. Her posture stiffened, and as she turned away, her eyes glistened. The royal insider later claimed Camilla whispered something that cut straight through her, something that wasn't meant to be overheard, but was meant to wound. The staff didn't move. They didn't speak, but they noticed. One later described it as a silent declaration of war. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The message had been delivered with elegance, wrapped in silk, and carried by someone who had mastered the art of appearing supportive while orchestrating control. The line between cruelty and diplomacy blurred in that moment, and Meghan found herself standing on the sharp edge of both. Unable to compose herself, Meghan quietly excused herself from the room. She didn't cry in front of them. She wouldn't give them that. But those who remained felt the crack in the energy. The power dynamic had just shifted. Camilla had entered as the quiet observer and left as the dominant presence, and in Meghan's absence, the whispers began low, deliberate, and unmistakable. But while Meghan retreated in silence, the whispers outside the fitting room were growing louder, and the staff had already taken sides. Hidden in plain sight, the senior seamstress witnessed it all, every word, every glance, every stifled tear. And now, years later, she's spoken. Her private journal from that day reveals chilling observations and silent confessions the public was never meant to hear. She was there from the beginning, not just as a tailor of silk and lace, but as a quiet observer of power plays and emotional unraveling. Sworn to discretion like every staff member under the royal seal, she never imagined she'd one day record what she saw, not for gossip, but to survive the weight of what she'd witnessed. She didn't set out to betray the crown, but as she wrote her private entries in the days after the fitting, something inside her had already shifted. It wasn't just a dress fitting, her first line reads. It was a psychological ambush. Her notes begin with clinical detail times, names, fabric notes. But quickly, the tone darkens. She describes a woman, Meghan, entering the room with grace, but carrying visible emotional weight. Then came the string of cold interactions, one after the other, the comments, the stares, the way others would pause before responding to her requests. The seamstress recorded them all, but it was what Meghan said in a whisper, almost to herself, that the seamstress would never forget. They don't want me here, not really. A quiet confession. Too soft for confrontation, but loud enough to echo in the ears of someone who truly listened. And the entries go further. One note details a moment when Camilla, observing the modern neckline of the dress, leaned into a junior stylist and murmured, "Too modern for a Windsor, don't you think?" A comment delivered with a knowing smile and just enough volume to sting. The seamstress documented the moment as a weapon clothed in wit. She would later write that Meghan didn't react outwardly, but her shoulders stiffened, and she avoided eye contact with everyone for the next hour. Most disturbing, though, was the section describing the behavior of certain palace staff once Meghan had stepped away. The seamstress recorded how two assistants exchanged mocking glances, one of them mimicking Meghan's American accent in hushed tones. They laughed, barely stifling it. It was cruel, it was cowardly, and it was ignored by every superior in the room. The seamstress wrote that she wanted to say something but didn't. "I chose silence that day," she admitted in her final entry. "But I knew I was watching something cruel disguised as ceremony." Her journal, never meant to be public, had survived years locked away in a drawer. Only now, as the insider story began to unravel, did she feel compelled to speak, not for attention, but for absolution. What she saw wasn't just poor behavior, it was institutional coldness, a system that dressed up humiliation as protocol, and a bride slowly unraveling under the weight of forced civility. And while the staff whispered behind curtains, one person had overheard enough to confront the entire room: Meghan's mother, Doria. She wasn't supposed to speak. She was just the mother of the bride. But when Doria Ragland walked in and saw her daughter on the verge of emotional collapse, she made a choice. What she said to the royals in that room changed the energy in an instant and left even Camilla speechless. For nearly an hour, Doria had been seated outside the fitting room in quiet patience, sipping lukewarm tea, unaware of the storm building on the other side of the door. Meghan hadn't wanted to worry her. She had asked her mother to wait outside while she finished up a few final things. But when her assistant slipped out visibly rattled, eyes darting nervously, and whispered something into Doria's ear, everything changed. Without hesitation, she stood. No announcement, no request for permission. She simply walked in, the very force of her presence enough to stop every conversation mid-sentence. What Doria walked into wasn't a wedding preparation, it was an emotional battlefield. She saw her daughter standing rigid in her gown, her eyes glassy, lips pressed tightly together, holding in a scream only a mother could hear. Camilla stood nearby, composed, arms folded, eyes locked on Meghan like a hawk surveying weakness. Kate lingered at the edge of the room, visibly uncomfortable, as if caught between allegiances. The seamstresses paused, hands mid-air, as if frozen in time. No one moved, but Doria did. Her voice wasn't loud at first, but it was clear. Unshakable. She didn't speak in anger, she spoke in defense. And her words cracked through the stillness like a whip across marble. You will not break her before her wedding. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was stunned. Not a single soul in that room had expected the woman they had dismissed as a quiet observer to step into the center of the conflict and turn the power dynamic on its head. But that's exactly what she did. Camilla said nothing. For once she had no clever retort, no whispered dagger to throw. She simply picked up her gloves, clutched her handbag, and exited with the calm of someone who knew she had lost control of the moment. Kate, according to multiple sources, flushed red, her posture shrinking slightly. She looked toward the seamstress, then to the floor, offering no defense, no excuse. She had been present. She had witnessed it all, and she had said nothing. But Doria had. And that changed everything. The seamstress, still holding a measuring tape in her hands, would later write in her private journal that the room's entire energy shifted in that moment. It was the first time anyone spoke up for her, and everyone felt it. Doria didn't yell, she didn't curse, she didn't insult. She simply stood between her daughter and the silent forces trying to tear her down. And that act, quiet, powerful, unshakably maternal, reset the room. Meghan didn't need to say anything. Her eyes met her mother's, and in that gaze was 1,000 unshed tears, a lifetime of restraint, and the sudden safety of not being alone. But the moment, as powerful as it was, came too late to undo the wounds already inflicted. Camilla may have walked out, but her words remained. Kate's presence still lingered like a shadow, and though Meghan had her mother's support, the damage was already done, and what happened next left an irreversible mark on the palace. The dress was supposed to be a fairy tale. But after that chaotic fitting, Meghan reportedly considered walking down the aisle in something entirely different. The designer was caught in the crossfire, the palace panicked, and the symbolism of the gown was weaponized in a royal power play. In the hours after the confrontation, Meghan withdrew into silence. The fitting had left scars deeper than fabric could cover. What was meant to be the most magical moment of a bride's journey had become a battlefield of whispers, undermining glances, and veiled hostility. Alone in her room that night, surrounded by sketches and swatches once chosen with excitement, Meghan reportedly picked up the phone and called the designer. Her voice, according to one insider, was calm but exhausted. And her request was unexpected. She wanted to change the dress. Not just minor adjustments, but possibly an entirely different look. One that no longer carried the fingerprints of humiliation. The designer, caught between a creative promise and a political storm, listened. But even as they discussed possibilities, the walls around them began to close in. Word had reached palace aides within hours. The thought of Meghan walking down the aisle in a new design, especially one not pre-approved by the firm, sent tremors through the corridors of royal communication. Advisors began calling each other in a frenzy, warning that any deviation would risk media speculation, questions of instability, and worst of all, uncontrolled headlines. Charles, according to sources close to his camp, was livid. Not because of the gown itself, but because of what it represented. A last-minute change would signal chaos, rebellion, a bride unprotected and unsupported. And worse, it would hand the press an open window to dissect every emotional fracture inside the palace. It wasn't about style, it was about narrative, and they intended to own it, not let it unravel. Behind the scenes, aides tried to soothe Meghan, urging her to stick with the original design. They offered subtle praise, promised that everything would be smoothed over, but their tone was unmistakable. This wasn't a suggestion. It was pressure dressed in politeness. Meghan, already raw from the events of that day, faced a decision heavier than lace and embroidery. In the end, she chose to keep the gown, but not without reclaiming a piece of her power. Hidden within the hemline, stitched where no cameras could see, was a phrase added quietly, without permission, by the designer at Meghan's request: "I am enough." 3 words, sewn in defiance. 3 words to anchor her when the world around her felt like quicksand. That gown, once tainted by judgment, became a silent act of resistance, a secret affirmation tucked into the seams of tradition. And yet, while the gown was completed in silence, the fallout from that fitting was anything but quiet, and the palace was already working to control the narrative. Just days later, tabloids ran headlines about a tearful confrontation at Meghan's dress fitting. But the question remains, how did such specific details leak? The royal insider claims the source wasn't a distant staffer. It was someone far closer, someone with everything to gain from a scandal. The media's precision was chilling. Every painful detail from that harrowing day appeared, almost verbatim, in the press. The language was crafted to spark ridicule and sympathy in equal measure, designed not just to report, but to influence. The story wasn't just leaked, it was shaped. The timing wasn't coincidental either. It landed during a critical moment in the pre-wedding narrative, shifting public perception and planting seeds of doubt about Meghan's role, behaviour and emotional state. And yet, only a select few had been present at the fitting. A few seamstresses, a senior aide, Kate, Camilla, Meghan, and Doria. That was it, which meant the source had to be someone deeply embedded and trusted. According to the insider, Meghan immediately suspected sabotage. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was precision-targeted humiliation. She reportedly told a confidant that night, "This wasn't about a leak. It was about control. About reminding me who owns the story." Every outlet seemed to echo the same curated phrases that Meghan had never uttered publicly, but had been said within the safety of palace walls. Someone had betrayed that sanctuary. And it wasn't just about gossip. It was about power. Behind the scenes, Charles's communications team scrambled. They hadn't authorized the leak, but they were forced to contain its fallout. There were meetings, calls, internal reviews. They tried to spin the narrative, suggesting the report had been exaggerated, distorted. But no one could deny it. Too much of it had been true, word for word. And that kind of accuracy doesn't come from speculation. It comes from someone in the room. Then came the revelation. Quiet, internal, but devastating. The leak had been traced not to a junior aide, not to an outsider, but to a palace staff member who, weeks after the incident, received an unexpected promotion. The connection was never made public. No statement was issued. But for those inside the firm, the message was clear. Loyalty wasn't measured by discretion, it was measured by usefulness. If a leak could shift the narrative in favor of the palace, it was forgiven. If it undermined Meghan, it was tolerated, even rewarded. The insider later claimed the leak was strategically designed to fracture public support. It wasn't about dress drama, it was about casting Meghan as unstable, difficult, emotional. It was about writing a script before she had a chance to speak. And it worked. The damage was done. Trust was shattered. And once again, Meghan had been placed at the center of a narrative she didn't control. But just when the narrative seemed settled, a bombshell letter surfaced, something Meghan wrote and never intended for public view. Buried in a notebook filled with wedding notes and vendor contacts was a letter Meghan never sent but poured her heart into. Its contents are raw, unfiltered, and emotionally devastating. In it, she addresses a royal she never publicly named until now. The notebook was tucked away in a private drawer, forgotten beneath fabric swatches and thank you cards from florists and caterers. It wasn't part of any official archive, and no one expected to find anything meaningful in it. But as a former assistant quietly sifted through boxes while transitioning out of the household, she found the pages handwritten, folded and dated just 2 days after the final dress fitting. There was no envelope, no address, just a name scribbled at the top, one that was smudged, but unmistakable. The contents of the letter, never intended for the public, have since shaken everything that followed. Meghan began by recounting the events of that day, describing the fitting not as an artistic moment or ceremonial milestone, but as soul-crushing. She did not write about lace or sleeves. She wrote about silence, stares, and the emotional exhaustion of navigating cold smiles and sharper tongues. Her words are deliberate, carefully chosen, yet seeped in pain. She referenced someone she described as a woman who wore a crown and sharpened her words like knives. Though she didn't name her directly, every insider who read the letter understood it wasn't Kate, it was Camilla. The letter goes deeper, revealing a rawness the public had only speculated about. Meghan wrote, "I smiled through the humiliation, but I felt their contempt. Every thread of that gown felt like armor I wasn't allowed to wear." She reflected on the betrayal not just from outsiders, but from those who stood closest, those who claimed to uphold tradition while privately wielding it as a weapon. The tone of the letter is not bitter, it is mournful, reflective, and above all, deeply human. But it was the closing line that delivered the most haunting blow. "I hope one day your daughters are spared what you gave me." It was not a curse, it was a plea. A wish born from suffering, not vengeance. It revealed that Meghan, despite everything, still held on to empathy even for those who had tried to break her, and in doing so, exposed the full extent of how calculated and personal the attacks had been. She wasn't merely rejected, she was diminished by design. The letter was never sent. Perhaps it was never meant to be. But now that it has surfaced, it serves as both testimony and indictment. A glimpse into the emotional wreckage left behind not by scandal but by orchestrated cruelty. And though the palace has never acknowledged its existence, its words have echoed louder than any press release ever could. And as this letter surfaced, it reignited questions about the Crown's complicity and who really orchestrated Meghan's unravelling from the inside out. For years, they stayed silent. But now, the royal insider who witnessed it all from inside the palace walls is breaking their silence on camera. Their final testimony confirms long-whispered suspicions, exposes new betrayals, and reveals what the royal family desperately tried to bury. The interview was conducted in secret. No studio lights, no makeup team, no royal PR filter standing by to sanitize the narrative. Just one voice, altered to protect identity, and one burning mission to finally speak the truth. This wasn't a disgruntled ex-staffer seeking attention. This was someone who had been present through every quiet humiliation, every backhanded comment, every strategic silence. Someone who watched the dress fitting unfold not as an isolated emotional event, but as the final stroke in a larger, darker orchestration. From the start, the insider made it clear Meghan's mistreatment wasn't accidental. It wasn't a clash of cultures or a misunderstanding of protocol. It was, in their words, a coordinated effort to emotionally isolate her from within. Meetings were held. Instructions were given. Staff were allegedly told to maintain professionalism while testing her limits without leaving bruises. A phrase, the insider said, haunted them long after the directives ended. It wasn't physical abuse, but it was psychological warfare disguised as royal etiquette. And at the center of it all, the dress fitting. That single event, now infamous, was not spontaneous chaos. According to the insider, it was engineered. The fitting was just the tip of a planned campaign, they revealed. Camilla's arrival, Kate's comments, the passive-aggressive gestures from staff, it had all been set in motion to push Meghan closer to the edge without ever appearing overtly cruel. A masterclass in plausible deniability. And everyone played their part. Perhaps most chilling was the confirmation that Meghan's downfall had been anticipated. She was never meant to succeed within the firm, the insider stated. She was meant to serve a role. But the moment she began rewriting that script by speaking up, by demanding respect, by carrying herself with too much confidence, the palace turned cold. What followed wasn't just resistance. It was silent sabotage, camouflaged in civility, orchestrated with precision. And when asked what they remembered most about that day, the insider didn't hesitate. It wasn't the dress. It wasn't the whispers. It was the moment Meghan looked in the mirror and didn't recognize herself. She didn't cry over the dress, they said. She cried because she saw the truth. That no matter how perfectly she performed, they had already decided who she was. A moment of devastating clarity wrapped in satin and sorrow. The interview ended not with vengeance, but with vindication. The truth, buried under years of silence and spin, had finally broken through. And while it didn't erase the pain, it shattered the illusion that this was all just drama, or miscommunication, or difficult personalities clashing. It was systemic. It was deliberate. And now, it was undeniable. And that truth still haunts the palace, because it was never about the dress. It was about the war no one admitted they were fighting. Until now. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.